Hey, good afternoon, everyone, in U.S. History 1. I'm going to try to put up a brief video for Chapter 12, Manifest Destiny for U.S. History 1. I know not everyone watches these videos, no one's required to, but I'm trying to think of a way in which, if we're not meeting traditionally in class to have lectures, besides using publishers' YouTube videos and other scholarly material out there, to get a sense of presence with me and with the class and with the mount, I think it's important I put up something, hopefully to make a connection with you in terms of some kind of I don't know, classroom dynamic in some way. And hopefully to bring some information to light that maybe you didn't understand in the book, or to enrich it a little bit. Maybe it doesn't work. I know about half of you, based upon my tracking, are watching these things, but it's kind of like a smorgasbord. I put out as much as I can. You take as much as you want. You're paying for it. I'd like to think that you take advantage of at least considering what I think were the salient portions of this chapter. Manifest Destiny. I think it was coined in the 1840s by a guy named O'Sullivan. He was a writer. He had a sort of I don't know if it was a political newspaper, political magazine. It was called the United States Magazine, a Democratic Review. And John O'Sullivan, same name as a famous world championship boxer from centuries ago, coined the term, and it was a phenomenon that didn't start in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. It was around since really the birth of our nation. It was this concept that we had a view of our democratic ideals were superior than those of anybody else's in the world, that our people were made up of special stuff, for lack of a better way of saying it. Our spirituality, our culture was superior than anywhere in the world. And our democratic institutions, along with our makeup, made us destined to spread the democratic and our institutional values throughout the continent. We're going to go from east to the west coast, and we're going to dominate the continent because it's almost a God or preordained destiny for the American people. And he ultimately coined the term, John O'Sullivan did in his article, I think it was 1845, called Manifest Destiny. And what he did was he basically articulated this undercurrent of philosophical views that many political and everyday citizens actually held, that we almost were ordained by God to spread democracy, to spread our cultural superiority, and to become basically a beacon of democratic values to be spread throughout the world, largely by continent, conquering and developing the North American continent. And that becomes important when we get to the discussion of Native Americans and Native American removal. There was a recognition that Native Americans were here first, but there was a belief that we were of a superior people, perhaps a superior race as well, but we also had superior technology and institutions, and our governmental framework was such that either we incorporate the Native Americans into the American tapestry, if you will, or we remove them. And that value system was so strong, that paternalistic and condescending, actually, in many respects, value system led to this concept of manifest destiny. The westward expansion was in large part motivated by this philosophical view. And it's hard to wrap your mind around the terminology. What does this manifest destiny mean? There's a lot of it on the final exam. But I like how the author kind of broke it down to three parts. First, many Americans believed that the strength of the American values and institutions justified moral claims to the hemispheric control. Second, the lands of the North American continent west of the Mississippi River and later in the Caribbean regions were destined for American-led political and agricultural improvements. We knew best. Third, God in the Constitution ordained an irrepressible destiny to accomplish redemption and democratization throughout the entire world. They're kind of almost overlapping values, all three of them. But it was this view that wasn't that necessarily we believed in ill intent on anyone, but we knew what's best. We're superior people. And there were some people that when we deal with the Native American questions that do come to I don't want to say climax because it depends on your philosophical view of during the era, but the domination of the Native American peoples weren't always done with a view that these people should be condemned or they were lesser of a human race than the human race, a lesser subsection of the human race, if you will. Some actually had a very paternalistic view in terms of they believed they were doing the right thing, and they wanted to civilize these native organizations and groups and tribes. Either way, it led to the destruction of sovereignty of the Native Americans in their different regions. They were either removed, or the attempts to Americanize or indoctrinate Native Americans into sort of the Caucasian culture, the American culture, as it was identified, destroyed their culture. And there's no question about it. Whether it was ill intent, the one, the real racist and superioric, outlook, or whether it was paternalistic, we know it's better for these savages and we can convert them to good people. Either way, it was destructive to the Native American cultures in our North American realm. No question about it. So American exceptionalism, territorial expansion, democratic participation, and economic independence. Even Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was against the Mexican-American War, which we'll get to in a little bit, he believed in this young American movement, this concept that we're better, we're bolder, and we deserve it simply because it was ordained by God. And that's a belief that still, I think, resonates in the American people on some level. It's a bit, when you analyze it and try to put your feet in another nation member's shoes, you can see how arrogant that view is. But, when you hold the view, it's sometimes, and if you're an American, sometimes it says what we are. We have a superior democratic system. We have superior institutions. We have the greatest economy in the world. We have the greatest institutions in the world. And we have individual liberties like nobody else. Although there would be an argument that these institutions, as they exist, are often under threat. That doesn't mean they don't exist. And there's this attitude. That's manifest destiny. A big part of it's manifest destiny. And I love this art. This is almost shown in every history book. I'm glad they put it in here too. This art rendering of this as a propaganda of, her name is Columbia, and it's a female figure. She leads Americans west to the future by carrying the values of republicanism, democratic government through representative form, and through Roman garb. And progress is shown through the inclusion of technological innovations, like she's carrying telegraph wire with her. And she's clearing native peoples and animals being pushed into the darkness because we're a superior race. We're superior people. And they need to move aside because it's ordained by God. Very, very much in hindsight, a tragic story, because those people that were genuinely concerned about Native Americans at the time often took a naive approach about either incorporating them into the American culture or thinking actually removing them to other areas like west of the Mississippi River would somehow preserve them and protect them in their native cultures, giving them the worst lands in the nation and things like that. Some of them actually thrived for a period of time, but once those lands became attractive to, like a better way of saying it, white America, they get pushed out even further and further and further. So the antebellum West migration, Indian removal, and the question, the real pressure, and this pressure existed since colonial times, since the Revolutionary War. Part of the revolution was over the fact that the British Crown didn't want us to go west of the Appalachian Mountain range. And part of that tension was, hey, after we fought the French and Indian War, we should be able to expand west. But it cost the British Crown, the British government, a great deal of effort to appease Native American groups in that region. And they didn't want us to participate for it. And it was a real tension in our country that westward expansion, those lands are ripe for taking. We know what's best. We know how to do agricultural practices that the Native Americans don't do. The land is green, it's raw, it's fallow. Let's go and do it. And the British Crown didn't want us to do it. And that's one of the causation factors of the Revolutionary War. And you learn that from earlier chapters. And so this burning push for land, not free land, but cheap land unused, instead of being back in some crappy job in the East that you didn't feel you had hope and or the ability through self-determination, which was a big philosophical movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau, they both captured that individualistic experience. But if you didn't have promise to be able to grow back in your community, where was the promise? Out west. New virgin lands to conquer and to gain economically, and independence. Independence is always this mantra in the American culture. And I'm not saying independence from foreign governments or from a tyrannical government, but independence from working for others at menial, income that doesn't allow you to grow and basically be um, your own sort of self-determiner. And that's what the push to the West was. And there was a publisher, I forgot which newspaper he was, he actually ran for president one time, named Horace Greeley. And if you ever look up the picture of Horace Greeley, he had really wild hair, kind of an intellectual. And his statement to basically, especially the young American movement, was these people that believed that we were destined to conquer the West, but it was also the movement that through our superior intellect, our superior cultural values, our education, our knowledge about agriculture, technology, and all the rest, called for us to use those skills in that superiority by moving west. And Horace Greeley's famous saying to the young Americans who felt stifled in basically non-moving careers in the lack of lands that were in the East that were all taken up by others already, go west, young man, go west. And that was the mantra of the era. And Horace Greeley, I think, is mentioned in the book. But I always love that phrase, go west, young man. Yeah, here it is right here. The New York Tribune. Do not lounge in the cities, commanded publisher Horace Greeley in 1841. There's room, health in the country, away from the crowds and the idlers and imbeciles. Go west before you are fitted for a life in the factory. The New York Tribune often argued that American exceptionalism, we're just better, required that the United States to benevolently, I don't know how you do this benevolently, meaning with kindness, conquer the continent as the prime means of spreading American capitalism and American democracy. And when you mean it by benevolently, you don't just go and massacre people, but that's what was done in part. It means to basically show that we are a superior people, and therefore God destined us to control those areas. And here's the line that I wish they stressed a little bit more in this section of the chapter. It says, expansion, Western expansion by largely white America, hinged on a federal policy of Indian removal. There was a movement also to indoctrination, to assimilation, but it didn't always work. It was very difficult to have, centuries of American culture evaporate and have American, but it did. They actually created schools and things like that for Native Americans to become, I don't think it's that, but they thought it was civilized citizens, to learn to be lawyers and doctors and physicians and all these different things, and to be farmers, and to not carry on with pagan rituals that we thought were barbaric. And some of it was successful in the sense that these schools often did produce future leaders of Native American groups because they became educated and learned to read and write, and to become educated in law and medicine and political processes. But whether it was through domination and conversion or whether it was for removal, they had to get out of the way or join us, one or the other. And the bigger movement was removal. There's no question about it. I think this is the next section dealing with a couple of cases that came up. Yeah, we know Florida. Florida was not yet, in the early 1840s, was not part of the United States. It was still fragilely possessed by Spain, but there were a lot of former freed and escaped slaves living in Spanish Florida, there were many tribes, but they became called the Seminole tribes. There were multiple groups down there. And there was tension because the land and the farmland was very, very attractive to Southern farmers. They wanted to take over. And don't forget, the other Southerners were slave owners. And to see just across, a fairly short, expanse, that there were freed African Americans that actually had militias was appalling to white slave owners in the southern region, and they wanted to do something about it. And tensions kept raiding, and they had these private groups that would basically gather up militias, and they would go down in raids, and there was British encampments and Spanish encampments, and they raided them, and it triggered the federal government to ultimately come in with war. And this is where Andrew Jackson becomes one of his exploits as an adventuring war hero, was basically taking on the Seminole tribes, but also the African American freed I don't want to call them, they wouldn't be quite cities, but developments and settlements along the area. And in fact, one general called it, it wasn't an Indian war, it was a Negro war. And so these battles between United States service members and vigilantes, for lack of a better way of saying, between formerly freed slaves of African descent and different Native American groups, ultimately pressured. Spain was going to lose it anyways. They were holding on to it with the thinnest of a thread. And basically a treaty came about. It's called the Adams-Onis Treaty. And this came about, I wish I had the specific date. I know it's 18... I wish I had the specific date when they came in. It says, but for $5 million, really, really disturbing. The Seminole Wars were from 1835 to 1842, and Florida became a state in 1945, and that's after that for $5 million, all of Florida, and really remarkable. Well, it was better than getting nothing, and basically peacefully ending whatever conflict that was going on in terms of armed battles between the two. The desires to remove American Indians from valuable farmland motivated state and federal governments to cease trying to assimilate Indians, instead planned for forceful removal. So there were some that were trying to assimilate Native Americans. Not that that's a good thing, but at least it's violent for being removed from your home, I would think. But to be changed from whoever you are, what your belief systems are, what the way your family dynamics work, your religious values, whether you're a hunter-gatherer, whether you're a farmer, to suddenly be converted to basically European belief systems had to be tragic enough, but it wasn't working. It wasn't nearly as successful. So the movement from assimilation did become the movement to removal. Let's get them out of here. And where are they going to go? They're going to go west of the Mississippi. And that was the view, that there were lands there. Some people thought it was a good idea, meaning it was a good idea not just for white America to take over the areas, but it was also good for the Native Americans because they could basically find their own sovereignty, their own power, their own freedoms west of the Mississippi and not be interfered with. And many of them thrived, especially with the conquest of the horse that the Spanish had brought in. There was many of these plain Native American Indians, Cherokees and other groups, they did very, very well for a period of time. Now, one of the things I like to spend a moment on, because it's one of my favorite topics, Supreme Court. We know that there's three branches of government. A lot of people like to call them co-equal branches of government. I'm not a fan of that. There's three branches of government that have certain powers within the realm that create checks and balances between the different branches. And one of them is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has the power to nullify actions of state governments, the power to nullify actions of a president, and the powers to nullify actions of the Congress if it's deemed to be in violation of the Constitution. And that term is called the power of judicial review. I know I reviewed it in previous chapters with Justice John Marshall. Everyone thinks it's just him, but there's other members of the court, obviously, that all agreed to them that they have the power to do that. Well, for a long time, when the Supreme Court made a decision, they weren't always the most controversial. People said, well, that's the law of the land. We're going to live with it. But a case came down where the Cherokee Nation that had sovereign lands, there was treaties already providing that they could possess lands within the state of Georgia. And when they possessed those lands within the state of Georgia, they became sovereign. They were a nation within a nation. They had the power to be left alone. And then when the state of Georgia, with the help of Andrew Jackson, who was the president, decided, let's move these people out of here. Let's get new treaties. Let's create new laws requiring them to leave for their own good, supposedly. We know it's not. It's for the good of white Americans that want to take over. It went to the Supreme Court. The first case, they basically deny it. We don't have jurisdiction. But the second case, Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia laws did not apply within the Cherokee Nation. They are a sovereign nation within a nation. Their lands within the state of Georgia, federal government, state government, they have no reach. And it's not in the book, and I wish it was. I don't know if it's written anywhere, but Andrew Jackson supposedly said, John Marshall, he's still in the court, in this year of 1832, he's been on the court for over 33 years at that point. Andrew Jackson said, he's made his ruling, meaning John Marshall. Now let him enforce it. Historically, after this case, there's been almost no court decision that's ever been ignored by the other branches, meaning that if the Supreme Court says, President, you can't do that. Congress, you can't do that. State of Georgia, you can't do that. What's the response? They grumble, they complain, they bitch and moan, but then they comply with the rulings of the Supreme Court. Yes, and if they're so outraged, they amend the Constitution to get around a Supreme Court ruling, or over time they push for, when justices die or retire, new justices that will come on and hopefully change their stance on a very controversial issue. This is pretty shocking in the time. There was another case, and the book doesn't describe it, that came down later that made the Supreme Court look like they were kind of in agreement that maybe the removal of the Native Americans was acceptable or something like that, largely to save face. But look what the Supreme Court said. Cherokee Nation, you're right. You get to live in Georgia. State can't interfere with you, nor can the federal government. And what do? They remove them physically. Some did it by agreement because they got money and they got promises of lands west of, not great lands, but lands west of the Mississippi River. And many left voluntarily. In the Cherokee Nation was split on that, meaning some of the Native American Cherokees wanted to agree to the, I don't want war. Let's just agree to this. We're getting some money. Let's move on. It's feudal otherwise. The other half wanted to fight and stay. It ultimately led to one of the most bitter moments in history for the Cherokee people, and that's called the Trail of Tears, where I forgot how far they actually walked, but 16,000 Cherokees embarked on the journey, and only 10,000 actually completed it. I think it's over 1,000 miles they had to walk in really horrid conditions without appropriate supplies, and they just died on the trail, and that's why it's called the Trail of Tears. I think a really sad part of American history. And not too long ago, one of our presidents was giving an award to some Native Americans. I don't know whether they for service in some fashion or another, and the president gave them the award right in front of the Andrew Jackson portrait, and they were very, very insulted. And a lot of people did, and maybe the president at the time wasn't knowledgeable about this principle, but many Native Americans look at Andrew Jackson not only as a warrior against Native Americans, the Seminole Wars in Florida, but later as president, basically helping states remove Native Americans to less fertile lands west of the Mississippi that killed many of them and certainly destroyed cultural values and institutions, as really, really the most anti-Native American president we've ever had. So I know I've talked to a couple of Native Americans who said that in some of their groups, they won't even carry a $20 bill on them because Andrew Jackson's on it. Andrew Jackson's a mixed bag, no question about it. Indian removal also occurred in the north, just not on such a large scale. This was the push. You got to get them out. So western, and when I say western, I'm talking about the area west of the Appalachian Mountains. So it's the Mississippi Valley. It's not so far into the plain states and into the. It will be soon when we have the Mexican-American War, but initially it's basically the breadbasket of the country from the Great Lakes all the way down to Texas that we're talking about here in this area. Texas is still part of Mexico. Well, might as well talk about that. No, I don't think. Yes, eventually white incursion and ongoing Indian wars resulted in traumatic dispositions of land, struggle for subsistence. We know these different groups. Many of them thought that Native Americans were morally and intellectually equal with the whites, and they sought and they made this thing called the Indian school system, which had some great successes. So it wasn't all people being evil towards Native Americans, but we know the end product has an evil result. Removal and Americanizations reinforced Americans' sense of cultural domination. So if we weren't removing them, we were changing them. In either event, it kind of tells us we're right? We're better. And they got to join us and they got to leave. Life and culture in the West. I don't think it's pretty straightforward stuff in this section of the book. Yeah, federal aid provided essential for the conquest and settlement of the region. There's no question about that. Much of the federal lands initially were only sold in very large allotments, and they became much smaller and more affordable. So pioneering families can go and take advantage of either free land, the 160-acre tract under the Homestead Act, or very, very modestly priced lands in the Midwest. It's really the Midwest. And many people took advantage of it. David McCullough, the famous historian, I believe he lives in Martha's Vineyard. I got the chance to meet him once. Just like corny, like get in line with a million other people and meet him. Not like my buddy or anything like that. He wrote a book not that long ago. I think it's called The Pioneers. And it's really about this unbelievable exodus from the eastern seaboard, east of the Appalachian Trail into this western breadbasket and beyond from north to south to try to scratch out a new life for yourself. And it was very romanticized in art and in literature and everything else. And it was a very, very tough life. No question about it. Oh, another thing that helped was obviously the burgeoning railroad system was helping with travel and interconnectedness, but also the canal system. One of the things that New York is called the Empire State, and it's true, not only because of the port of New York being a great seaport, but also because they made the Erie Canal basically all the upper Midwestern states that were tied into the Great Lakes system. Now navigation was possible because of the Erie Canal, bringing commerce right basically over New York City and down to the port of New York. And it really created the Empire State, paid for itself in a very short period of time. It's not in your book, but there's a whole, I know most of you already picked your topics and are writing your paper at this juncture in the semester, but I find canal writing sounds kind of boring, but it's really fascinating how the cost of the Erie Canal, not paid so much by the federal government, but by the state government, state of New York. There was people said, we're going to build this thing. It's going to make a ton of money. We're going to get paid back. It's a great investment. And it got paid back very, very quickly. And it turned out to be one of the most economically sound investments by any government ever. And that's the debate we always have. When we're moving west, should the government participate in creating roads and highways and canals and train systems and things like that to help the American people, or should it just be up to the American people to eke out their way? Should be private enterprise and private companies doing it? We've always had the debate. We still do to this day. How much should government be involved in infrastructure and or the progress of humankind, if you will, or should the government just stay the hell away? And there's a balancing going on there. Yeah, establishment of railroads enabled a rapid expansion after the Civil War, but a little bit before as well too. Yeah, it was not only territorial expansion, but also economic expansion of our nation. Now, Texas and Mexico. Spain can't hold on to Mexico, and after 1821, there's a Mexican Revolution, and now Mexico is independent. Texas, the region we call Texas, Arizona, Utah, California, that's all part of the Mexican territory. But after the Mexican Civil War, there was a bit of a vacuum in terms of use and growth and things like that. And the Mexican government openly invited Americans to come in and create settlements, especially in Texas. These Americans that were in Mexican Texas, they called themselves Texans. They were doing very well, but it was predominantly the region we think of as Texas was significantly populated by American citizens. And things are going well for a period of time. The Mexican government is very unstable, and they're switching different groups are taking control. Then finally, the government changes substantially, and they're getting concerned about this encroachment of basically American citizens basically living and controlling Texas, that they do a couple things. One of them is they ban slavery in the Texas territory. Outrages those in Texas. In fact, one of the slogans of Texans was, "We have to keep Texas free for slavery." Talk about an oxymoron, right? That was one tension. The other is the Mexican government required that the settlers in Texas had to convert to Catholicism. Now, many of you might be Catholics in this class right now, but in that era, many of the people in the southern region were not Catholics, and that was a repugnant thing too. Did the Mexican government really do much to enforce? No, they were just basically ignored at the time. No real hostilities are breaking out, but they're ignored. But there's a recognition that culturally, and maybe even racially, many of the Texans are identifying themselves with really as Americans. So it's going to create some tension. And there's this manifest destiny where many Americans think that we should take Texas and we should take other Colorado and California and Arizona. Those should all be controlled by this. And so there was this raising. One is the banning of slavery. The other is supposedly the requirement that you be Catholic to live in the area. And we know General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, governed as a dictator, repudiated the federal constitution, which the Texans were happy with in 1824, pursued a policy of authoritarian control, crushed several revolts throughout Mexico, in the American Anglo, right? Settlers in Mexican Texas, or Texans as they were called, opposed Santa Anna's centralizing power. So they issued a statement of purpose and emphasized their commitment to the Constitution of 1824 and declared Texas to be a separate state within Mexico. And what happened shortly thereafter? Santa Anna cracks down. And where does he do it? He does it at one is really famous. Remember the Alamo? And he attacks the Alamo with superior forces. A lot of people think, I just watched the thing with Jay Leno, a person on the street. He does these like historical questions, and he asks, who won at the Battle of Alamo? A lot of people say the Americans, well, they're Texans. And they didn't. They lost. The American settlers in and at the alimony got creamed. And not only did they lose, any survivors were executed. But even more troublesome was Gilad. I don't know if I ever pronounced it right. Goliad. Right around the same period of time, the Texan rebels not only lose, but several hundred of them get captured, and they think they're going to get marched out to maybe some shipping, maybe be sent back up to America, or released, or put into some kind of, I don't know, settlement camp, something like that. And they all get executed on the side of the road. And that's where the phrase comes, remember the alimony. The hatred of Santa Anna was tremendous. And we know that sparks many of the other Texans have to flee. They flee back into the United States. Stories of horrid treatment by the Mexican military under Santa Anna comes back. And we know it's going to break out in war. And that's the Mexican-American War. And it does not last long. I think it's a 2-year battle, but it's really basically a year. Santa Anna was captured in the aftermath, compelled to sign a treaty in 1836. He withdrew his army from Texas and acknowledged Texas as independent. That lasts for 10 years, roughly. So why didn't Texas just become part of America? Why didn't we take it in for statehood? Many people wanted to. Many people did not. Why? It wasn't so much that we didn't necessarily like Texas to come in, but many of the Northerners, especially the Northern Whigs, later to become Republicans, were fearful that Texas would be what? Which it already kind of was. A slave state. It'd be a slave territory. And it wasn't so much that the Northerners were always against slavery. It was against tipping the hat, or the scales, I should say, towards more dominance in the government for those states that were influenced by the slave industry. And that turned a lot of people off. So it took 10 years. For 10 years, Texans mostly wanted to become a state within the United States. But we recognized it as a country, a very strong ally. We had a lot of influence with them. There's no question about it. And there's president after president was trying to basically bring in Texas into the fold. And we knew it was probably going to happen at some point. But the question over slavery would have to be resolved first, because that was the acrimony. Now, there was a constant debate. Basically, so from 1836, I believe, is when, Santa Anna gave Texas its own republic, the Republic of Texas. And sometimes you hear it goes, I'm from the Republic of Texas. They're referring to that basically 10-year period, because in 1845, it finally does come to become a state. Once it's a state, there's a debate over where the southern boundary is. Is it all the way down to the Rio Grande, which is what we contend? The Mexican government says it's about 150 miles north of that, at the Nueces River. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation of that. I've always been terrible at that kind of stuff. And the real question was, well, how far do they do it? And we know what happens. Basically, there's a military encampment. We go down there and occupy this strip between the Rio Grande and the Nueces River. And we know the Mexican government comes in with the military. They kill 11 American soldiers. That's it. Polk, who was a real pro-expansionist president, he gets a declaration of war, although Mexico never declares war on us. They get their butt kicked, and it was a very short war. And as a result of that, with United States forces in Mexico City, they're dominated, right? It's over. They say, hey, how about a peace treaty? And that peace treaty, we're going to give, I think it was $15 million. The peace treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, February 2nd, 1848. The United States gains lands that included California, Utah, Nevada, most of Arizona, and parts of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Pretty good deal. What did Mexico get? $15 million. Sounds like an arm's length transaction. We beat them militarily. And I say we because I'm American, right? And so the New Southwest attracted diverse groups of entrepreneurs, religious people. The Church of Latter-day Saints, then called the Mormons, they went out into that region as well, Utah. And it said the U.S.-Mexican War had an enormous impact on both countries. The American victory helped the United States on the path to becoming a world power, and Mexico lost roughly half of its territory. Really remarkable. And the questions still remained, and the tensions remained high. A lot of people think the Civil War just started in 1860. It's brewing. And a lot of it's brewing over these new regions that come in. Will they be free? Will they be slave? How will we determine it? Will it be determined based upon the Missouri Compromise from 1819, or will it be another compromise that will happen in 1850? Or will it be popular sovereignty? I mean, we'll let the people of those territories vote, and then people that were, anti-slavery would flee or rush to that area, and so would people that were pro-slavery. It was a real acrimonious time. Although we're expanding the country, most people are happy about the expansion. People are very, very concerned about the rising tension over whether or not the two territories will be free or slave. And now the gold rush. Now, what's interesting about the gold rush, we all think that the western, push beyond the Colorado mountain range, or the Rockies, I should say, was to get to California. Most of it was to get to Oregon. Oregon had very, very rich soils and excellent water and things like that. And so the Oregon Trail was a much bigger draw to population settling in the area. But what happened in California, from the football team that Joe Montana used to play for, it became known as the Gold Rush, and they're called the 49ers for a reason, because the Gold Rush in San Francisco was a big part of it, because gold was discovered. And I think they always cite this thing. I think it's Trivia Pursuit. There's a sawmill there. Somebody discovers gold, and that really took off. Yeah, population of San Francisco was only 500 people in 48, became 50,000 in 53. 100-fold. Really amazing. It really because of the gold rush. And so we've got this real western push. Not only for the settlement of Oregon, for agricultural purposes and timber and lumber and things of that nature, but California largely for gold. Although California has some beautiful areas for agriculture too, not quite as rich as Oregon, in my opinion. Now the Monroe Doctrine, and we need to know how the Monroe Doctrine got developed and Manifest Destiny. They're very much related. The Monroe Doctrine, a lot of people think it's like a law. Well, I guess in some ways it is. It's like anything the government's willing to enforce is kind of like the force of law. John Quincy Adams is pretty much the drafter of this concept, but we were worried about competition for trade, for economics, probably more than anything, in the Western Hemisphere. We didn't want anybody coming in that wasn't already established to do any new colonization, any new imperialism. We wanted people to stay the hell out. And we basically claimed that we had the power to police, if you will, the entire Western Hemisphere, from basically, obviously, anything within the United States boundaries, but even, north and south, we could prevent other European or any Asian, could be any, could be any other, Russian was part of it too. Any incursions into these areas would be deemed an act of war against the United States, even though, we don't own Costa Rica, we don't own Nicaragua, we don't own, Brazil or Argentina or all those other nations. So what business is ours? It's our business because the Western Hemisphere, we have dominance, and we won't risk our physical security, nor will we risk our economic security by letting foreign intrigue impact those areas. And we still believe in the Manifest Destiny. I mean, well, it's related to Manifest Destiny, but the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe was at the time, but it was John Quincy Adams that really crafted the concept. Teddy Roosevelt's going to expand it later, and it's called the Roosevelt Corollary, where he adds on to it. He says, not only do we have the ability to keep foreign intrigue out of these nations, we have the right to go into those nations to create stability if our property interests and our economic interests are at risk. It's really an amazing phenomenon that still, we think there's problems anywhere in South America, anywhere in North America. We think we're the big brother, and we should the no one else can. No, absolutely no one else can. But if we want to get in there for our self-interest, we can. And it's very much related to the concept of Manifest Destiny. The expansion of economic opportunity and protection from foreign pressures became the overriding goals of U.S. foreign policy. And U.S. foreign policy is what? The Monroe Doctrine. Stay out of the Western Hemisphere is what we're telling these people. We didn't kick people out that already had interest there, but we're not going to allow them to expand beyond what they were doing, and nothing new is coming. There was also this real interesting thing called filibustering. And it's not the filibustering in the Senate where you have to get over 60 votes to get somebody to stop talking, and it really slows down the passage of it. We're talking about basically private groups would often go and try to dominate foreign countries. This guy named William Walker, one of the most fascinating pieces of history, He went down to I believe he took over. Where did he take over? People wanted to do it in Cuba. People tried in Cuba. People did it in Florida before Florida became a United States state. Where is it here? Yeah, filibustering launched elsewhere, including by William Walker, a former American soldier. Walker seized portions of the Baja Peninsula in Mexico, later took power and established a slaving regime in Nicaragua. He's eventually executed in Honduras. But wealthy Americans would do these filibustering, and they basically go down and try to spread manifest destiny beyond the continent. Really remarkable attitude. Anyways, that's a lot in chapter there. I think it's a fascinating chapter, but it's really, we think of the birth of the nation in 1776. In some ways, the birth of the nation's in this era where we decide to really expand west of the Appalachian Mountains, and we're going to conquer what we think of as modern day the United States. We're going to wrap it up. We're going to get these lands from what we think of as the map pretty much today. Happened during this era, either through the Mexican-American War or through treaties with Spain, and one with Great Britain for the Oregon Territory comes in that era too, and also some dealings with Russia. But I went a little too long. I apologize. Hopefully that kind of brings some, ties in some of the information as you read it. Be well.